Black Hebrew Israelites typically believe that the transatlantic slave trade is biblical prophecy fulfilled in our American context.
It is.
Admirably, they have an amazing knowledge of the horrific evils that took place in the slave trade, but sadly, much eisegesis is imposed on the biblical texts that are not a byproduct of genuine hermeneutics and interpretation of Scripture.
Such as?
Understand that the Bible does not endorse slavery, but it gives all the principles that deconstructs the evil institution of slavery we face in America. One scripture we need to memorize doing apologetics in the African American context is 1 Corinthians 7, verse 21, where Paul says, "Art thou a slave, or art thou called being a servant? Care not for it, but if thou mayest be made free, use it rather." A book I highly recommend that talks about the ethnic composition of those who were impacted by the transatlantic.
So that point there, the slavery that he was talking about there is not the slavery that the transatlantic slave trade experienced. Okay. Or the judgment that happened in the Roman and the Greeks. That was not the slavery he was talking about, where they was killing people. Because slavery existed in the nation of Israel, and the slaves had privileges and benefits. So that type of slavery was more like a employee that had benefits, just like kind of like what you have today. You go to a job that you volunteer to go to. The difference is you volunteer to go to this job, but you were purchased in that particular captivity, and that was, you had been given, they purchased you, right? And you were their slave, and it wasn't, you got to go into the book of the law and read what the Most High said about how to handle slaves, what was the rights to the slave, right? If a slave came into your household, he was to get all the benefits of an Israelite. He had to be circumcised, and he had to follow the laws, statutes, and commandments. So there were laws and statutes and commandments as pertaining to how to treat those people who were so-called slaves. But the Greek slave under Ptolemies and the Roman slavery under Titus and Vespasian, and the slave trade under the African nations that enslaved the so-called Negroes that had established and developed a kingdom in Africa called Negro Land, which is history. Those types of slavery was not the slavery that Shaul, who you call Paul, was talking about. Because the Most High said, "Thou shalt not kill," murder. So that was not supported in the slavery that Shaul was talking about. All right. That's all I'm going to say on that. Okay, continue.
Those who were impacted by the transatlantic slave trade is by John Thornton. And it's the book called Africa and Africans and the Making of the Atlantic World. Interestingly, Dr. David Daniels, who wrote an article for the Jude 3 Project, says this. Listen intently, because it radically informs how we talk about this issue. The historian John Thornton and others have convinced me, at least, that among the 20 plus Africans who were illegally transported to the Virginia colony included Christians. The evidence includes a 1619 letter written by a local Roman Catholic bishop who says, expressed outrage, listen to this, that 4,000 plus African Christians from West Central Africa have been captured by slave traders. This letter shows then a significant presence of African Christians in one of the regions where Africans were captured by slave traders. Friends, it's a misnomer for us to not believe that there were genuine Christians in Africa that were part of the transatlantic slave trade. Therefore, we cannot say Christianity is the white man's religion, because they knew of Christianity before their engagement with the white man in many instances.
Stop.
We can
No. There's two different types of Christianity. And like I said, I don't embrace the terminology Christianity because I don't deal with the Greek Christos. And that has a whole nother meaning, but that's another lesson. But you have those that were believers of the Messiah that was not influenced by Roman Catholicism. Okay. So the Christianity that you're speaking of that was imposed on the so-called Africans that you detail from West Africa, which they didn't come from West Africa. They came from Negro land, which encompassed a whole continent from east to west. Okay. They were forced to be Roman Christians. And how do I know that? When I went to theological seminar, I asked a question about Acts 4 and the Church of Antioch. What happened to the Church of Antioch? The theologian told me they have no history of what happened. So all of the history of the Christian church connected through Rome and the Protestant movement, and then the Methodists, and then the Baptists, and then the Pentecostals, and the Episcopalians, and the Lutherans, etc. Right? Jehovah's Witness, all of that, right, came under the mother of harlots, which is the Roman Catholic Church, right? So the Hebrews that he called the Africans that was captured wasn't in the Messianic movement of Christianity. They were in the Hellenized version of the Roman Catholicism, which basically was a reduplication of the Egyptian sun worship. That's why they changed the day of worship from Saturday to Sunday, because the Egyptians worshiped the sun. A good book, since you're referring books to get, is called Two Babylons. Okay. And I'll leave a link for the author of that book. You can get that. I have that in my library. Okay. There's plenty of older books, and I'll leave some links that you can read where it actually explains that. One book that really explains a lot is a book by Leo Africanus. He lived during the 1400s. Real good book. He has, I think it's 3 volumes. Okay, but get all 3 volumes. You can go to Google and you can type in Leo Africanus Histories of Africa, and it'll pop up. You can download a PDF. You don't have to pay a dime for it because those books are out of print. But Google has done us all a favor. They've scanned books and they made them free online. You can get them, right? So to his point, he's off on that. They were not believers in the Messiah Yeshua. They were believers, followers of the Roman Catholic version of this Eurocentric reduplication of Egyptian sun worship.
That all those who were impacted by the transatlantic slave trade were Israelites, where they were from different regions of Africa, and they all had different religions in and of themselves. A general cursory reading will demonstrate that in history. Point number 8. Have you consulted the best commentaries on Deuteronomy? Highly suggest this. You can have a genuine dialogue.
Stop. Red flag. Whenever you get a Bible that has commentaries, just remember it's just simply comments that the person who is doing the translation or a person who is doing the presentation are telling you what their thoughts is. It's not written in stone, as the saying goes. It's just a person's opinions. Now, when a person gives you a reference of eyewitnesses, that's different. But when a person gives you their opinion because this is what I believe, that's what got us in a lot of trouble. This is what I believe. Who cares what you believe? If you can't prove it, right, the book of the law says, out of the mouth of 2 or 3 witnesses shall every truth be established, right? So if that be the case, you ought to be able to, if you make a statement about something, you ought to be able to find 2 or 3 witnesses. And I don't mean people that's in your group. Okay. If you're talking about something that happened 2,000 plus years ago, then you ought to be able to find somebody at least like Josephus, or somebody like Strabo or his Herodias or some of the writers in the city of Timbuktu, authors that lived during that period of time that wrote books. Somebody back there ought to be able to tell you something, right? So don't be giving me no books from somebody in the 20th century unless they confirm or validate what they're saying from somebody who was in the previous centuries or back beyond. All right.
With somebody who is believing some of the doctrine found in Black Hebrew Israelism, you need to know specifically how Deuteronomy is interpreted from a Christian perspective. Referring back to point 7, much of the eisegete.
I don't care about how Deuteronomy 28 is interpreted from a Christian perspective, because for the most part it's wrong. I'll tell you why I say it's wrong. We all know this song. We're blessed in the city. We're blessed in the field. No, I'm kidding. Okay, where'd they get that from? Deuteronomy 28. Right? That was a pronouncement to the nation of Israel. So that was what? A prophecy that the Most High gave to the prophet Moshe to speak to the children of Israel, to let them know this is how you're going to know. Now, let me stop for a minute and go to Deuteronomy 28, right? And I want to read a specific verse in there that's going to bring clarity to what I'm trying to say. All right. Now, he talks about a sign and a wonder. Right. So that's verse 46. It says, well, let's read the verse before that. This is verse 45. He said, let me back up a little bit. Now, some of this Deuteronomy 28, I'm going to say this right. In my research, some of these things that we see here, we didn't see happen in my historical research in the Greek and Roman captivity or Babylonian captivity. But we did see it in the transatlantic slave trade. And listen, he says, thou shalt beget sons and daughters, but thou shalt not enjoy them, for they shall go into captivity. That in itself, we know for a fact that is the history of the so-called Africans in this nation. 42 says, all thy trees and fruit of thy land shall the locust consume. Okay. So the stranger that is within thee shall get up above thee very high, and thou shalt come down very low. We know that's factual in America. Even to this very day, foreigners coming here, get loans, start businesses, but the so-called Negroes get nothing. You got a job though. Then it said, oh, here's the kicker. He shall lend to thee, and thou shalt not lend to him. He shall be the head, and thou shalt be the tail. Oh, my mercy. Let me sing that song. I'm the head, and I'm above. I'm the head, not the tail, right? Where's your currency with your pictures on, with your name on it? Who you loan the money to? We borrowed the money. FDIC isn't owned by black people. All right. He says, moreover, all these curses, this is verse 45, shall come upon thee and shall pursue thee and overtake thee till thou be destroyed, because thou hearkenest not to the voice of Yah, thy Elohim, to keep his commandments and his statutes which he command thee this day. So he's saying, because you broke the commandments that he gave Israel, he said, all these curses shall come upon thee. Right? What curses? We just read. Sons and daughters going to be sold. Right? He going to lend. You going to be, the stranger's going to get above you. Right? He going to lend to you and you're not going to lend to him. Then here's the verse 46, which is the kicker. He says, and they shall be upon thy sign for a wonder and upon thy seed forever. So as a whole, because there are individual situations where that is not true, but as a whole, when you look at the so-called African American community, you can see that there appears to be a curse on us. We have great knowledge. Why can't we build communities like other people, other ethnicities build their communities? We build a community and people move out. Why is that? Okay. Then he says, because thou serve not Yah with joyfulness and with gladness of heart for abundance of all things. Now, let's skip all the way down to verse 68. I like making sound effects. Skip all the way down to verse 68. All right. Since he said that you have to see Deuteronomy 28 properly interpreted way Christians interpret. No, we don't want it. We don't want 28 to be interpreted the way anybody interprets. We want it to be at face value as to what the scripture says is going to happen. All right. So once we see that, okay, before we get to 68, the Most High said, let's look at 60. Let's see, yoke of iron. I saw yoke of iron. Okay, all right. Okay, I'm not going to do that one because this is going to make this video lengthy. But let's just point out, I want to point out okay, this here is saying Yah verse 60. Moreover, he will bring upon thee the diseases of Egypt, which thou was afraid of, and they shall cleave unto thee. Okay? The diseases of Egypt, the plagues of Egypt, right? I want to point out, because this chapter is so big, but okay, look at verse 63. Look at verse 62. You shall be left few in number, whereas ye were the stars of heaven for multitude, because thou would not obey the voice of Yah. It shall come. So the few in number means that you shall be the minority, right? And that's what we are. We have become the minority, right? Especially in this nation. And he says, now here's the kicker here. Verse 64, he says, Yah shall scatter you among all people, from one end of earth unto the other, and their fathers, it says, from one end of the earth even unto the other, and there thou shalt serve other gods, which neither your fathers have known, even wood and stone. What's the symbol of the Christian church? The cross. Now I know you say, "Well, brother, the cross is not a wood symbol. I got a cross on a piece of jewelry." The cross, before it was a piece of jewelry, was a symbol of wood. Okay? And it didn't originate with the Roman Catholicism. It originated in Egypt under the worship of Tammuz, right? But the Europeans got it, and they Hellenized the religion of Egypt and formulated the religion of Roman Catholicism, which is the Hellenized European version of the Roman sun worship, of the Egyptian sun worship, which is, I already covered that already, right? So he says, thy life shall hang in doubt. Let me go back. Verse 64, Yah shall scatter among all people from one end of earth until the other. Okay, I read that part. Let's go. Now, verse 65. And among these nations shalt thou find no ease. Right? Neither shall the sole of thy foot have rest, but Yah shall give thee a trembling heart. Heart attacks. Right? That's what when your heart trembles, you have. What has been the number one killer amongst black people? And don't say black on black crime. I did my ancestry research on my family and found out that majority of the people that died in my family died from heart conditions. Is that a coincidence? You might believe it is. But this passage says that they shall, he said, Yah will give them a trembling heart. And he says, and failing of eyes and sorrow of mind. Okay. So I'm not going to deal with the physicality of the failing of eyes and sorrow of mind. But the failing of eyes could be physical, and it could be spiritual, meaning that, you don't see no way out of this situation. I think it's more so dealing with that. All right. And thy life shall hang in doubt. So that basically kind of confirms what he said in the previous verse. And thou shalt fear day and night, and shall have no assurance of thy life. Right? In morning thou would say, I wish it was evening. And in evening thou would say, I wish it was morning, for a fear of thine heart, where thou shalt fear, and for a night, for the sight of your eyes, which thou shalt see. And Yah, here's the kicker here. This is the part right here that you cannot dispute. Right? Although, I'm going to say this here before I read it, although we can see that this happened more than one time, we cannot deny that this is not how that the so-called African Americans and Negroes got into the Western Hemisphere. All right. So with that said, now let me just say this too before I read it. I already covered the Greeks took Israel into ships. Romans did it, right? And then the transatlantic slave trade took Israel far beyond the borders. Okay, we can read that somewhere. I'm going to go there in a minute, but let me finish this 68 because you got to see this, right? Yah shall bring thee into Egypt again with ships. Now, I always tell my Hebrew brothers and sisters, you got to properly apply this, because if you don't, somebody will take this and eat you alive. So we don't deny the fact that Israel went back to Egypt in ships. It happened. We can read about it in Maccabees 3 when the Greeks or Ptolemies took Israel. We can read about it in the works of Josephus in the War of the Jews, where he says Titus took them back to Egypt and put them in Egyptian mines, right? Okay, but it didn't stop there. Okay, let's continue to read because you can't stop reading there because it's going to make sense. He says, by the way, wherever I spoke unto thee. Okay. So that's talking about all of the verses before this is what he's talking about. Okay. Thou shalt see it no more again. Now the it he's making reference to is the land of Israel. Because we're going to show you in a minute that he removed Israel far from their borders, right? All right. It says, wherever I spoke to thee, thou shalt see it no more again, and there you shall be sold unto your enemies for bondmen. Okay. And there you shall be sold. So it was in Egypt. And we read about Negro land, right, is where the beginning of the transition of slave trade began, right? We know about the history about some Israelites that was taken up into Spain, was scattered, and then eventually ended up back into Morocco and North Africa. Then we know about Israelites that were already, that the world don't call them Israel, they call them Negroes that were in Africa. And there's a book called It Began in Babel, talks about how that the Negroes were Asiatic, that Asia was the land of the Negroes. Okay, I'll leave a link to I'll leave a link on that for you. Okay, and he says, and from there, and thou shalt see it no more again, and there you shall be sold to your enemies for bondmen and bondwomen, and no man shall buy you. Okay, so you say, well, brother, it says no man shall buy you, right? In the Greek and the Hebrew, in the Hebrew, the word is kana, which means it says to erect, to procure, right? Okay. In that meaning, it also does mean to sell, and it means to own. Okay. So, but no man shall buy you is the word to erect or build you up. Erect means to build, or to create, by extension to procure. Okay. So that's the first meaning of the word. Now in the Hebrew, you gotta understand that a word could mean a negative and a positive in Hebrew, depending on the context in which it was written. That's the proper application. That's what the pastor is trying to talk about, exegesis. That's a Greek terminology, and hermeneutics and all of that. Those are Greek deities, right? But I won't deal with that. But that's another lesson for another day. All right. Now, so let's go to Joel chapter 3, because Joel chapter 3 actually explains what Deuteronomy 28, what happened in Egypt was not the complete fulfillment of that, because Egypt is not far from the borders. Egypt is close to the borders, right? Egypt, as a matter of fact, is a neighboring country to Israel. So that's not far from the borders. That's close to the borders. So now I'm going to go to Joel chapter 3. Joel chapter 3 is indisputable, right? It says, behold, I want to skip down. I want to read the whole thing because there's a lot in here. Let's see. I want to get down to the verse where he talks about it shall be removed far from their borders, that you have removed them far from their borders. Okay, so that's verse 6. All right, he says, the children also of Yehuda and the children of Jerusalem. So now that dispels the myth that only the nation of Israel went to one place. He said the children of Yehuda and Jerusalem have you sold to the Grecians, that you might remove them far from their border. See that? Remove them far from their border. So that's what they did. They removed Israel far. If we want to look at it, we'll see. The word, it says remove far, is the word rakah, which means to widen, that is, intransitively to recede or to remove, literally to place relation. Okay. And then now if we go to this other word, remove from their borders, it says gebul is a cord as twisted, that is, implication, a boundary, by extension, a territory enclosed. Okay. So Israel was removed from their borders. Okay. That's why he said you shall see it no more, because you are going to be sold, right, to not just to one place, Egypt, but he says, let's look at in Joel chapter. You got to read Joel chapter 3 fully, because once you read it, you'll be indisputable. It will be indisputable that the children of Israel are the so-called African Americans, blacks, and Negroes. But it says, verse 2, I will also gather all nations, bring them down to the valley. Jehoshaphat will judge. The word says plead, but the word Hebrew is judge, shaphat, with them for my people and my heritage Israel, whom they have scattered among the nations and parted my land. They have cast lots for my people, and have given the boy for a harlot, and have sold the girl for wine that they might drink. See that? So he says they have scattered them among the nations. Verse 4 says, yeah, what have you to do with me, O Tyre and Zidon, and all the coasts of Palestine? There is a book, since you refer books, that you can get that talks about what? They use the terminology Jews of Spain. How did they get there? On ships, right? So you can get that from reading. Now I'm going to do this here because I've been long going with this lesson, and I want to give the brother Cam a chance to finish out. Okay.